Imagine walking into a diner for a peaceful meal, only to be judged, mocked, and harassed by the very person who's supposed to protect you. That's exactly what happened to two black veterans one cold afternoon. But what the officer didn't know was that he was about to get the lesson of his life, and in front of everyone. It was a quiet afternoon in a small-town diner, the kind of place where the hum of conversation blended with the clinking of silverware and the low sizzle of bacon from the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air, warm and comforting, wrapping the little diner in a blanket of familiarity. Outside, the wind rustled against the glass windows, but inside, everything felt calm, ordinary, and safe. The door creaked open, and two older gentlemen stepped inside. Their presence drew a few curious glances, not because they were strangers, but because they carried themselves with a certain quiet dignity. Their steps were steady, deliberate, as though each one held years of stories untold. These weren't just any customers. They were veterans, brothers in arms. Time had carved lines into their faces, silver streaks into their hair, but nothing could erase the aura of resilience they carried. Dressed simply, one in a worn leather jacket and the other in a clean but faded shirt, they didn't need to boast about who they were. Their silence spoke louder than words. Men who had once risked everything for their country. The waitress, a young woman with a bright smile, recognized them immediately. She'd seen them before, sometimes together, sometimes alone. She always admired the way they greeted everyone kindly, the way they carried respect in their tone. Today was no different. "Afternoon, gentlemen," she said warmly, guiding them to a booth by the wide window. The men thanked her politely, their voices calm but commanding, the kind of tone only men with discipline could have. They settled in, scanning the menus though they already knew what they wanted. Coffee black, eggs toast, and maybe pie if there was room afterward. Simple meals for men who had long ago stopped needing extravagance. As they waited, their conversation drifted into soft laughter and stories from their service days, memories of long nights in the field, of friends they'd never forget, and of lessons learned the hard way. The waitress listened from afar, smiling to herself. There was something heartwarming about watching two old friends share a meal, their bond unshakable even after all these years. For a moment, everything was perfect. It was peace. It was friendship. It was normal. But as life often reminds us, normal can shatter in an instant. The soft hum of the diner was broken by the sharp jingle of the front door bell. Heads turned as a police officer stepped inside. He wasn't just any cop. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of authority that demanded attention. His boots thudded heavily against the tiled floor with every step, echoing louder than they should have in the small, quiet room. At first, no one thought much of it. A cop walking into a diner wasn't unusual. But something about this man's demeanor was different. His eyes scanned the room slowly, almost like a predator sizing up its surroundings. He wasn't there to grab a quick cup of coffee or to exchange pleasantries. He was looking for something, or rather, someone. And then his gaze locked on them. The two black veterans sat peacefully at their booth by the window, their conversation mid-flow, their laughter still lingering in the air. But the instant the officer's eyes met theirs, the atmosphere shifted. His lips curled upward, but it wasn't a smile, it was a smirk, a twisted expression that carried arrogance, disdain, and something darker. Without hesitation, he strode across the diner, ignoring the other customers completely. Every step felt deliberate, calculated, as if he wanted the sound of his boots to announce his power. When he reached their table, he didn't greet them. He didn't even acknowledge them as fellow men. Instead, he leaned forward, towering over them like a storm cloud ready to break. "Well, well," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Didn't know this diner started serving people like you." The words hit the room like a gunshot. Silence fell instantly. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Coffee cups hovered midair. The clinking, the chatter, the laughter, all of it died in an instant. Even the cook in the back seemed to pause. The faint sizzling of the grill, suddenly the loudest sound in the room. The waitress froze, a coffee pot in her hand, her knuckles whitening as she tried not to spill. Her eyes darted nervously between the officer and the two veterans, unsure if she should intervene or stay quiet. The veterans exchanged a single glance. Calm, steady, men who had stared down danger in the most hostile places on earth. They had faced worse than this, yet they knew what was happening wasn't just about them. It was bigger. But the officer wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, his shadow stretching across the table, his tone sharper, crueler. "Bet you boys think you're tough," he spat. "Tell me, what do you even know about serving this country?" The two veterans sat quietly, their hands resting on the table, their coffee cups untouched. They didn't flinch. They didn't raise their voices. Years of discipline and service had taught them how to face aggression without giving it power. But the officer wasn't interested in peace. He wanted a reaction. "You know," the cop said loudly, his voice carrying through the diner so that everyone could hear, "folks like you don't really belong here. Maybe you should just leave before you embarrass yourselves." Gasps rippled across the room. A young couple at a corner booth exchanged nervous glances. An elderly man with a newspaper slowly lowered it, peering over the rim of his glasses. But no one said a word. The silence in the diner was suffocating, heavy like the air before a storm. People wanted to intervene, but fear held them back. Who stands up to a cop in uniform? The veterans, however, were not ordinary men. One of them, a man with silver hair and sharp, steady eyes, lifted his gaze. He didn't tremble. He didn't falter. His voice, calm yet firm, cut through the tension like a blade. "Officer," he said evenly, "we've served more years for this country than you've probably been alive, and we've bled for freedoms that allow you to sit here in that uniform." The words hung in the air, bold and unshakable. A few heads in the diner nodded almost instinctively. The truth in his voice was undeniable. But instead of backing down, the officer's smirk deepened. He leaned closer, his shadow casting over the table like a dark cloud. He wanted to break them, to humiliate them. "Oh yeah," he mocked. "And what proof do you got? Anyone can say they're a hero." The arrogance in his tone sent a murmur through the room. Some customers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the veterans and the officer. It was clear to everyone, this wasn't about law, or order, or justice. This was about ego, prejudice, and power. But in that moment, the officer made his biggest mistake. By demanding proof, by questioning their sacrifice, he had opened a door he wasn't prepared to walk through. The veterans exchanged another quiet glance, one that said without words, "It's time." For a long moment, the diner sat in tense silence. The officer stood there, his chest puffed out, waiting for the veterans to stumble, to falter, to prove him right. But instead, the second veteran, who had been quiet through the whole exchange, slowly shifted in his seat. His movements were calm, deliberate, and every eye in the diner followed him. He reached into his jacket pocket. Instantly, the officer's body stiffened. His hand twitched toward the holster on his hip, the tension in the room snapping tight, like a pulled wire. A woman in the back gasped. Someone whispered, "Oh no." But the man wasn't pulling out a weapon. Instead, he carefully placed a small, weathered box onto the table. Its edges were frayed, the leather cracked with age, as though it had been carried through decades of storms and battles. With steady hands, he slid it open. Gasps filled the room. Inside, resting against velvet lining, was a Medal of Honor. Its blue ribbon shimmered under the soft diner lights, and the golden star glinted with a brilliance that seemed to silence the very air around it. The waitress's eyes widened, her voice barely more than a whisper. That's the highest military award there is." The customers leaned forward, stunned. Phones lowered, coffee cups forgotten. Everyone knew what they were looking at, an honor so rare, so sacred. It was only awarded to the bravest of the brave. The first veteran leaned forward, his voice calm, steady, but carrying the weight of 1,000 memories. "You wanted proof. Here it is. And let me be clear. We don't owe you, or anyone else in this room, an explanation. We've fought in wars you'll only ever read about. We've carried brothers home who never made it back. We've seen the cost of freedom, and we've paid it in blood." His gaze locked onto the officers, unflinching. "And while you stand here mocking us, remember this. Our service is the very reason you even have that badge on your chest. Without men like us, that uniform you're so proud of wouldn't even exist." The officer's face drained of color. His smirk melted away, replaced by a look of shock, then shame. His mouth opened, but no words came out. For once, he was speechless. And then the diner erupted. For a moment, the diner felt frozen in time. The officer stood there, his face flushed, his jaw tight, but his confidence was gone. The silence was deafening, until a voice finally cut through. From the counter, a young man in his 20s stood up, his hands trembling but his voice strong. "You should be thanking them," he shouted, his words ringing through the diner, "not disrespecting them." All eyes turned toward him. Encouraged, another customer, a middle-aged woman with tears in her eyes, rose from her seat and added, "They're heroes. Show some respect." It was like a spark igniting dry wood. Voices rose across the diner, one after another, strangers united in outrage. The same people who had sat silently, too afraid to intervene before, now spoke up with courage. The waitress, who had been holding back her emotions all this time, finally snapped. Her voice shook with both anger and resolve as she pointed toward the door. "Get out. You're not welcome here. Not if you treat people like that." The officer's jaw clenched. His eyes darted around the room, realizing he was outnumbered, not by force, but by truth. The authority he thought he carried had crumbled in an instant. Red-faced and humiliated, he muttered something under his breath, but no one cared to hear it. With his head low, he turned and stormed out, his heavy boots echoing like a defeated drumbeat as he disappeared into the street. For a long breath, the diner was silent again, and then applause. It started with a single clap, hesitant but proud, then another and another, until the entire diner erupted in a wave of clapping, cheers, and heartfelt gratitude. Customers rose from their seats, walking toward the two veterans, shaking their hands, patting their shoulders, thanking them for their service. A young boy, no more than 8 years old, tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered loudly enough for the table to hear, "Mom, they're real heroes, aren't they?" The veteran with silver hair turned, his stern expression softening into a warm smile. He bent slightly to meet the boy's gaze.